On July 1st, 1863, in the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the bloodiest battle in American history began. 51,000 soldiers lost their lives in 3 days, and this battle changed the fate of the Civil War forever. But how did it come to this? How did the United States come to a point where its own citizens killed each other so ruthlessly on its own soil? And more importantly, why Gettysburg? Why did this small Pennsylvania town become the place that determined the fate of an empire? To understand this, we need to go back a little. By the summer of 1863, the American Civil War had been going on for over 2 years. The Confederate armies of the South were displaying unexpected resistance and mastery, especially on the Virginia front. The Army of Northern Virginia, under the command of Robert E. Lee, had repeatedly overpowered the much larger and better supplied Union forces, crippling the North's generals one by one. The Union Army, which had suffered a heavy defeat at Fredericksburg, experienced one of the most embarrassing routs in history at Chancellorsville in May 1863. Lee had defeated a force almost twice his size, even despite losing Stonewall Jackson. But no matter how brilliant these victories were, they did not bring a real solution for the Confederacy. The South's resources were melting away. The ports had been blockaded by the Union Navy. On the Western Front, Ulysses Grant was melting away Confederate territory step by step along the Mississippi River. Vicksburg was on the verge of falling. Lee saw the situation very clearly. Staying on the defensive meant losing in the long run. The South's only chance was to carry the war to the North. This was Lee's second major invasion of the North. The first was made into Maryland in September 1862 and ended in a bloody draw at Antietam. That attempt was based on both a strategic and political calculation. If the Confederacy gained territory, England and France might decide to recognize it, but it didn't happen. Now 8 months later, Lee was rolling the same dice again, this time with a bigger stake. In June 1863, Lee crossed the Potomac River with his 75,000-strong army and entered Pennsylvania. The plan had several objectives. First, to wrest the war-weary lands of Virginia and feed his army from the rich farms of the North. Second, to force the Union forces on the defensive to protect Washington. Third, and perhaps most importantly, to take advantage of the war weariness of the Northern public. The 1864 presidential elections were approaching, and Lincoln's determination to continue the war was under political pressure. If the South gained territory, pro-peace voices might rise in the North, and the negotiation table could be opened. Lee's plan was bold, but it was as risky as it was bold, suffering from a major vulnerability, a lack of intelligence. Confederate cavalry commander Jeb Stuart was not by Lee's side during the critical days of the battle. Stuart had gone on a massive cavalry raid to ride around the Union lines and hadn't returned for weeks. This meant Lee was flying blind. He didn't know where the Union Army was, how fast it was advancing, or from which direction it might come. Significant developments were also taking place on the Union front. After the disaster at Chancellorsville, Joseph Hooker had been removed from command and replaced by George G. Meade. Meade was not a brilliant commander. No one called him a genius. But he was cautious, resolute, and resilient. Only days after his appointment, he had to move toward Pennsylvania after Lee with his 90,000-strong army. Where the two armies would meet had not been planned at all. Their meeting at Gettysburg was entirely the result of a coincidence. On the morning of July 1st, a division under the command of Confederate General Henry Heth was sent to Gettysburg to look for shoes. It had been rumored that there was a shoe warehouse in the town, and the boots on the soldiers' feet were already riddled with holes. As Heth's soldiers approached the town, their expectations were quite modest. A little shopping trip, maybe a minor skirmish. But Union Cavalry Commander John Buford was there. Buford was an experienced commander with sharp instincts. He had arrived in Gettysburg 2 days earlier, surveyed the surrounding hills and roads, and immediately grasped the strategic value of the place. All major roads heading south intersected in this town. Whoever controlled this point would control the geography of the battle. Buford decided to hold on until reinforcements arrived. At 8 in the morning, the first gunshots were heard. Buford's cavalry troops opened fire on Confederate infantry on the hills west of town. The Confederates thought it was just a few cavalrymen. As they marched on them, the resistance increased. Heth called for reinforcements. Reinforcements came from the opposite side, and just like that, completely unplanned, the two armies met at Gettysburg. By noon, reinforcements had begun to arrive for the Union side. General John Reynolds' troops rushed to take up positions. Reynolds was considered one of the most capable commanders of the Union Army. He was a name Lincoln had previously considered for Army command. But that morning, as he was coordinating the forward deployment of troops, a sniper's bullet struck him in the neck. Reynolds died instantly on horseback. This loss was a heavy blow to the Union in terms of morale. In the afternoon, the battle continued with full intensity. The Confederates were attacking from two directions, from the west and the north. Union troops tried to establish interconnected defensive lines, but were slowly becoming outnumbered. Holding on in the north of the town, the 11th Corps was routed under the pressure of Confederate forces commanded by Richard Ewell. Union soldiers scurried through the town's streets, their formations breaking down. Towards evening, the Union forces had to make a critical decision. Either they completely withdrew and dispersed, or they established a new defensive line on the hills south of town. Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill became the Union's final foothold that evening. Even though the soldiers were exhausted and demoralized, they held these hills. On the Confederate front, a critical moment occurred. General Richard Ewell had enough forces at his disposal to take these hills in the evening hours. Lee had asked him to take the hills, if practicable. Ewell waited. He did not attack. This decision became one of the great moments debated long after, among the decisions that changed the course of the war. The hills not taken that evening would be watered with the blood of thousands of soldiers over the next 2 days. When July 1st ended, it would not be wrong to say the picture presented a complex landscape for both sides. The Confederates had won the day. They had pushed the Union forces out of town and forced them into a disorganized retreat. But the Union soldiers had not been destroyed. They had regrouped, retreated to the hills, and established a defensible line. Both armies made their preparations that night. Reinforcements were on the way, and the exhaustion and grief were intense. Between 7,000 and 9,000 soldiers had lost their lives or been wounded on that first day alone. And morning would come. The second day would be much heavier. Lee sat in his headquarters early that morning, leaning over the maps. Yesterday had been won, but this victory was incomplete. The Union Army had regrouped instead of dispersing and settled on the hills south of the town. Now the question was, what should the next move be? Lee's second-in-command, James Longstreet, suggested retreating. He proposed a major maneuver around the Union Army's left to get between them and Washington. Thus Meade's army would be forced to attack instead of remaining on the defensive. According to Longstreet, waiting on the defensive would be to the Confederacy's detriment, but meeting a Union attack on well-chosen ground could yield devastating results. Lee refused. This disagreement between Longstreet and Lee became one of the most debated topics among historians in the decades following the war. Lee's thinking was clear. The enemy was in front of him, and the enemy in front of him needed to be crushed. Even though the defensive line looked solid, the Union Army had not yet fully settled in. If they moved quickly and struck from the flanks, the line could be broken. The plan was as follows. Longstreet would attack from the left, that is, from around Little Round Top and Devil's Den in the south. Ewell, on the other hand, would pressure Culp's Hill in the east. The two-pronged attack would split Meade in two, but the plan could not be executed as intended. Longstreet moved with a delay. The reason for this delay is heavily debated. Some historians argue that his objection to Lee's plan turned into a deliberate slowdown, while others blame logistical and terrain difficulties. Whatever the case, The attack could only begin long after noon, around 4:30. This delay was perhaps the hours that changed the fate of the battle, because during those hours something unexpected happened on the Union front. General Daniel Sickles was the commander of the Third Corps, a confident character who did not shy away from acting independently. He was not satisfied with the position given to him. A mile ahead, a slightly elevated ground called the Peach Orchard seemed to him like a better firing position. Without getting Meade's permission, he moved his division forward. This decision was a massive military blunder. Sickles's troops were left unsupported in the new position. Huge gaps opened on his right and left flanks. When Longstreet's divisions launched their attack, they met Sickles's disorganized defensive line and shattered it. The Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, Devil's Den. These names were mixed with the blood of thousands of soldiers until that evening. The Wheat Field, in particular, changed hands several times in a few hours, witnessed multiple clashes, and eventually became filled with intertwined corpses. Sickles' left leg would be blown off by a cannonball that day. He personally paid the price for his own mistake, but the real cost was paid by thousands of soldiers. Right in the middle of this chaos, one of the most dramatic moments of the battle took place. Little Round Top was a small but strategically critical hill on the left of Gettysburg. Whoever controlled it could fire down the flank of the entire Union defensive line. There were almost no soldiers on that hill that morning. Union engineering officer Gouverneur Warren noticed the gap while making progress on the hill. He acted without panicking. He diverted nearby units and ordered them to take up positions on the hill. The 20th Maine Regiment, commanded by Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, climbed the hill almost at the last minute. Chamberlain was a college professor. He taught rhetoric and modern languages before the war, but the combat intelligence and composure he displayed on Little Round Top that day exhibited a kind of courage unexpected from an academic background. Confederate forces attacked up the hill repeatedly. Chamberlain's 386-man regiment steadily dwindled. Their ammunition was about to run out. There was no choice left between retreating or holding on. There was only a third way. Chamberlain ordered bayonets to be fixed and initiated an unanswered downhill charge. This sudden and unexpected move surprised and routed the Confederate troops. Little Round Top was held. After the war, Chamberlain was awarded the Medal of Honor for this brave decision. But what mattered at that moment was this. If the hill had fallen, the entire Union left flank would have collapsed. The battle likely would have ended that day, and the outcome would have been very different. As the evening progressed, the violence did not subside. On the eastern front, Ewell's troops attacked Culp's Hill. It was a wooded, rocky, and steep terrain, a perfect place for the defending side, and a hellish place for the attacking side. Union defenders waited buried in trenches. The Confederates fell as they tried to climb through the rocks. Still, a partial foothold was gained. A section of Culp's Hill passed into Confederate control late in the evening. When night fell, both sides were almost frozen from exhaustion. Meade gathered his generals in his headquarters that night. Everyone spoke, exhausted, some wounded, some having not yet digested their losses. The question was clear: stay or retreat? A count was made one by one. The vast majority of his generals were in favor of holding on. So was Meade. He predicted the Confederates would attack the center tomorrow because both flanks had been attacked for 2 days. This prediction would turn out to be accurate when July 2nd ended. In that single day alone, between 16,000 and 18,000 soldiers had lost their lives, been wounded, or gone missing. Names like the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, Devil's Den, and Little Round Top were etched in blood into the American memory from that day on. Wheat fields and peach orchards had turned into open-air graveyards in a matter of hours. What Lee thought that night is not entirely known, but he decided to attack again in the morning, this time through the center. The third day would be much bigger, much bloodier, and much more decisive. 2 days of fighting had taken the lives of or wounded tens of thousands of soldiers. The terrain was pitted, trees were shattered, the soil was mixed with blood, and yet both armies still stood right where they were. Lee still wanted to attack. Meade was still defending. In the early hours of that morning, clashes flared up again at Culp's Hill. Union forces wanted to retake the positions that had partially fallen under Confederate control during the night. These clashes, which lasted from 7 in the morning until noon, were exhausting and bloody, but in the end, the Union defenders completely took back the hills. The threat on the eastern flank had been eliminated. When Lee heard this, he didn't change his plan. He had another long meeting with Longstreet that morning. The plan in Lee's mind was clear and dangerous. A direct infantry assault would be launched right into the center of the Union defensive line, onto that long stretch extending along Cemetery Ridge. Between 12,500 and 15,000 soldiers would march for about a mile across open terrain to pound and break the opposing line. Longstreet vehemently opposed this plan. In his memoirs written years later, he recounted telling Lee that morning, "General, in military history, no 15,000 men can cross that terrain and reach the opposing line." Lee insisted. Longstreet's eyes had filled with tears. He couldn't give the order to attack verbally. He just bowed his head. This attack went down in history as Pickett's charge. General George Pickett did not have a great reputation until that day. He had graduated last in his class at West Point and had a mediocre career in the Mexican War. But on the third day of Gettysburg, he stepped forward to command his division. Alongside him were the Pettigrew and Trimble divisions. The 3 divisions would advance together. An artillery preparation was planned before the attack. The Confederacy fired between 150 and 170 cannons simultaneously, with the aim of crushing the Union lines. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The noise was of indescribable magnitude. Soldiers later wrote that their ears rang, and they felt vibrations in the ground. The smoke was so thick and dark that the sky blackened. Union cannons returned fire. For about 2 hours the artillery of both sides pounded each other, but this long bombardment by the Confederate artillery did not yield the expected result. Most of the shells fell slightly behind the Union lines. They damaged supply vehicles in areas where horses were kept. The Union infantry lines remained relatively intact. Furthermore, the Union artillery deliberately slowed its fire so that the Confederates would think they had exhausted their ammunition and would launch the infantry assault. The plan worked. When the Confederate artillery fell silent, at 3:30, Pickett rode his horse and gave the order to the troops, "Forward." 12,500 men began their march into the open terrain. Every witness who recounted this scene uses a similar word, magnificent. And it truly was, in an eerie way. These men, marching in long straight lines with rifles on their shoulders and flags waving in the wind, were watched in awe by both the opposing Union soldiers and their own commanders. Longstreet could not bear to look at the scene. He turned his head away. The Union defenders waited at first, then the artillery opened up. When the first shells fell into the Confederate lines, the orderly march was disrupted slightly but continued. Men filled the places of those who fell and marched on. The Union's long-range rifles began to open fire at about 400 meters. Men fell, the lines opened, closed, and marched on. Smoke, shouting, the sound of drums. When they came within about 200 meters, the Union infantry began to fire their rifles, and at that point the formation shattered, caught in intense fire from the front and both flanks simultaneously. The Confederate divisions began to melt away in minutes. Some men managed to run forward, approach the Union lines, and even briefly broke inside. On Cemetery Ridge, in an area known as the Angle by the stone wall, a short but incredibly bloody hand-to-hand combat took place. Confederate Brigade Commander Lewis Armistead put his hat on the tip of his sword and led his men inside. He crossed the stone wall. A few minutes later he was struck by multiple bullets and fell. That moment was the furthest point the Confederates reached. It went down in history as the high water mark, the furthest point the Confederates were able to reach in this battle, and in all the great advances this battle symbolically represented. Then they retreated. In 20 minutes, maybe half an hour, the attack was over. Those who returned were less than half of those who had gone. Some divisions had suffered 60 or 70% casualties. Pickett's division was so heavily damaged that it could never recover as a division again. When Pickett was ordered to rally his division after the battle, the words that spilled from his lips were, "General, I have no division now." Lee rode out to meet his returning soldiers on horseback. "This is my fault," he said. He repeated it over and over. "This is my fault." This confession was a rare thing to hear from a commander like Lee. And it was true. The attack plan was flawed. The terrain had not been read properly, the enemy's defensive strength had been underestimated, and the impact of the artillery preparation had been exaggerated. Longstreet's warnings had been proven right. Meade did not launch a counterattack that day. This decision was also debated later. Lincoln, with great disappointment, sent a message to his general. Lee's army could have been destroyed. The war could have been ended. Meade's cautious stance paved the way for the war to be prolonged for 2 more years. But the Battle of Gettysburg was effectively over. On the evening of July 3rd, Lee began preparations for a retreat. On July 4th, American Independence Day, the Confederate Army moved south, leaving their severely wounded behind, accompanied by a long convoy of prisoners and supplies. It was raining. The roads had turned to mud. Union cavalry pursued, but didn't apply serious pressure. Lee returned to Virginia. In 3 days, the two armies had lost a total of 51,000 soldiers, dead, wounded, and missing, in a single battle, in a single town. This number was the highest casualty figure American history had ever seen up to that point, and it remained so for a long time. The fronts, hills, fields, and orchards of Gettysburg had all seen blood. When the townspeople stepped out of their homes, they saw corpses scattered in the streets, courtyards, and wheat fields. Thousands of horses had perished. The stench didn't leave the town for weeks. The battle was over, but its scars remained much longer. 8:51 a.m. The dust and smoke of Gettysburg had not yet fully settled before the question of what the battle meant came to the forefront. From a strategic outcome perspective, the picture was clear. Robert E. Lee had suffered a heavy defeat in his second major invasion of the North. The Confederate forces, which had entered Pennsylvania with a 75,000-strong army, had retreated with nearly 28,000 casualties. This was more than a third of his total force. Many experienced officers had lost their lives, names that would take months to replace, and sometimes would be impossible to replace at all. But the real importance was not the geographic, but the psychological outcome. One of Lee's primary calculations in entering the North was to deepen the Northern public's war weariness. A Confederate victory on Pennsylvania soil could strengthen pro-peace voices and force the Lincoln administration into negotiations. It backfired. Gettysburg did not shake the resolve to fight in the North. It reinforced it. The Confederates had entered Northern territory and had been defeated there. This was a powerful message for the Union, and exactly in those days, more than 1,000 miles to the west, another piece of news arrived. On July 4th, 1863, right after Gettysburg, the Union Army commanded by Ulysses Grant took Vicksburg. The Mississippi River was now completely under Union control. The Confederacy was effectively split in two. The connection between the West and the East was severed. Two massive pieces of news arrived at the same time. At Gettysburg, Lee was repelled. At Vicksburg, Grant won. When these two developments were evaluated together, the probability of the Confederacy winning the war mathematically shrank dramatically. But the war did not end. It lasted 2 more years. At this point, one must ask, if Meade had acted more aggressively, if he had pursued and destroyed Lee's retreating army. Would the war have ended in 1863? This is one of the most debated questions in historiography, and there is no definitive answer. But Lincoln's disappointment was real. When Lee crossed the Potomac and returned to Virginia, Lincoln's words were recorded, "My God, this is an unbelievable missed opportunity." Meade's defense was also understandable. His army had suffered heavy casualties, his soldiers were exhausted, and his supply lines were left behind. Chasing an army that seemed defeated also carried the risk of falling into a trap. As a cautious commander, Meade protected what he had. But as one of history's great what-if questions, he continued to stall after Gettysburg. To understand the consequences of the battle, looking merely at the military picture is not enough. The true weight of Gettysburg was felt in November, on the day of the ceremony, when the battlefield was transformed into an official national cemetery. On November 19, 1863, at the invitation of Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin, tens of thousands of people gathered in Gettysburg. The main speaker of the ceremony was Edward Everett, one of the most famous orators of the era. Everett spoke for 2 hours. It was poetic, comprehensive, and moving. The crowd listened with great attention. Then Abraham Lincoln took the podium. He spoke for 2 minutes, about 272 words. The speech was so short that part of the crowd said it ended before the photographers even had a chance to get ready. The next day, some newspapers belittled the speech, finding it insignificant. But what Lincoln said that day entered among the most enduring and powerful words in the English language. 87 years ago, our fathers founded a new nation on this continent, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. In that speech, Lincoln defined the war not just as a matter of land or power, but as a test of an idea. The men who died on these grounds had not fallen for a state structure, but for the proof of humanity's capacity for self-government, and the duty of the living was to ensure that their deaths were not meaningless. It is not our job to revive the honor of these dead. The real task is to complete the work they left unfinished. The Gettysburg Address reframed the meaning of the war, and this reframing also shaped the aftermath of the war. But what about those who fought? What happened to the survivors? Joshua Chamberlain continued to fight after the bayonet charge at Little Round Top. He was wounded multiple times. He remained in the Union ranks until the end of the war and rose to become a 5-star general. He became the governor of Maine. He served as the president of Bowdoin College. In 1914, 50 years after the war, he died of complications from his Gettysburg wound. Some sources cite him as the last military casualty of the Civil War. General George Pickett never forgave Lee until he died. He blamed Lee for the charge and carried this anger within him. He returned to Virginia after the war, worked in the insurance business, and died in 1875. His name is still remembered along with that bloody and tragic march. Longstreet, on the other hand, became one of the most controversial figures in the South. After the war, he joined the Republican Party and served during the Reconstruction era. This was considered an unforgivable betrayal among former Confederate officers. Following Lee's death, some Confederate sympathizers began to place the blame for the Gettysburg defeat on Longstreet. He lived under the shadow of this accusation for decades. Richard Ewell never fully explained why he delayed taking the hills on the evening of the second day. Historians still debate this question. And Lee? After the war, Lee submitted his resignation to Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Davis refused. Lee continued to command until the end of the war. He surrendered at Appomattox in April 1865. A while later, he accepted the presidency of Washington College. Today, this institution bears his name, Washington and Lee University. He died in 1870 at the age of 63. After his death, he became a legend in the South. He was placed at the center of the Lost Cause mythology. This myth claimed that the Confederacy was morally justified and was only defeated due to a lack of numbers and resources. Lee became the symbol of this myth, the flawless commander, the noble, defeated knight. But history eventually began to question this picture more. The lasting impact of Gettysburg was not limited solely to military or political dimensions. Over the years, the battlefield transformed into both a place of pilgrimage and the ground for a deep national debate. For decades, Northern and Southern veterans gathered here every year, shook hands with their old comrades from the front, and sometimes wept together. At the great reunion held in 1913 for the 50th anniversary of the battle, old men met again on that open field, where Pickett's charge took place, this time without rifles. But they rarely talked about the cause of the war, namely slavery, at these gatherings. This is also the most complex issue of Gettysburg, and more broadly, Civil War historiography. The war was the product of a conflict between a system that wanted to maintain slavery and a central government that wanted to restrict or end it. But in the decades following the war, this truth was covered up with frameworks like states' rights and Southern honor. The monuments on the Gettysburg battlefield celebrated heroism, but pushed aside the question of what those who fought were fighting for. In the 20th and 21st centuries, this interpretation was questioned again. Historians laid the Confederate founders' own statements, constitutions, and speeches on the table. It was shown that slavery was explicitly defined as a central principle in the Confederacy's founding documents. Gettysburg began to be reread in this context, not just as a story of heroism, but also as the defeat of a system fighting to maintain slavery. This shift in interpretation also paved the way for ongoing debates over monuments and Confederate symbols on battlefields. Gettysburg thus became both a battlefield and a mirror reflecting how America looks at itself, how it confronts its history, or how it avoids confronting it. What was buried in the soil of Gettysburg wasn't just tens of thousands of soldiers. In those 3 days, the fate of an idea was also determined. The possibility of the Confederacy existing as an independent state largely died on the red dirt of Pennsylvania. There was still a war that would last for 2 more years. The pain, destruction, and blood were not yet over. But after Gettysburg, it became increasingly difficult to find a serious strategist who believed the Confederacy could win. In this final section, we need to look at the broader historical legacy of the war and what it tells us today. Gettysburg occupies a unique place in the formation of American national identity. No other battlefield has been imbued with such deep meaning. There are several reasons for this. First, the geography. Gettysburg was a battle fought on Northern soil, right at the doorstep of Union citizens. Unlike the clashes in the South, this battle took place in Pennsylvania, on lands where ordinary Americans lived. Townspeople hid in basements, bullets passed through windows, their farms were turned into hospitals. The abstractness of war disappeared here. Its reality, concreteness, and proximity were confronted. Second, the timing. Coinciding with the fall of Vicksburg, the Gettysburg victory became the symbol of a turning point for the Union. After 2 years of collapses, retreats, and embarrassing defeats, the North finally saw that it could hold on and even win. Third, and perhaps most importantly, what Lincoln said that November day. The Gettysburg Address framed the meaning of the war in such a way that this framework remains valid today. In that speech, Lincoln tied the war to the founding documents, to the principles of freedom and equality. This connection elevated Gettysburg from being a mere military victory to the place where a civic test was passed. But how accurate, how constructed is this narrative? This question is an issue historians have dwelled on for many years. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address was a genius reframing, but it was also a selective emphasis. Initially, from Lincoln's own mouth, the war was a war to preserve the Union, not a war to end slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation had been issued 6 months before Gettysburg, But even this document had practical limits and was largely considered a wartime strategy. Watching how the Gettysburg narrative transformed over time is highly instructive for understanding how history is written. Immediately after the war, the North presented Gettysburg as a story of victory and salvation. The South, on the other hand, developed a different narrative. Within the Lost Cause mythology, Gettysburg was presented as a battle fought heroically but lost due to numbers and bad luck. In this narrative, Confederate soldiers were honorable warriors, not defenders of slavery, but guardians of a way of life. This myth became powerful and enduring. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when Northern and Southern veterans came together at Gettysburg, the heroism of both sides was brought to the forefront as a symbol of reconciliation. This rhetoric of reconciliation was politically functional. It was the emotional glue holding a divided country together. But the cost was heavy. Slavery was left out of this narrative of reconciliation. The true cause of the war was pushed behind a comfortable silence, and this silence permeated the American public memory for decades. In the mid-20th century, as the civil rights movement rose, this narrative began to be questioned. Black historians and activists brought the roots and legacy of the Civil War back onto the agenda. The fact that the battle at Gettysburg was won against a force fighting to maintain the system of slavery was voiced louder than ever before. This debate is still ongoing today. The debates regarding Confederate symbols in the American public sphere are directly connected to this historical legacy. Which monuments are erected, which names are given to schools and streets, how the war is taught, all of these are extensions of that deep conflict that began at Gettysburg. So what does Gettysburg tell us today? A few things can be said. First, about the weight of decisions. Every decision made in the war directly affected tens of thousands of lives. Lee's insistence on attacking, Ewell's decision to delay, Sickles' unauthorized advance, Chamberlain's order for a bayonet charge. Each of these was made in the moment, with incomplete information, under fear and exhaustion. History evaluates these decisions in retrospect and easily attaches right or wrong labels. But for those making the decisions in that moment, the picture was never this clear. Second, about how institutions and systems are larger than individuals. At Gettysburg, thousands of ordinary soldiers fought for causes they largely did not choose themselves. Many neither owned slaves nor actively defended slavery. They simply volunteered or were conscripted along with their neighbors. This fact does not belittle their courage or their suffering, but it reminds us that the forces behind the war were far beyond individual will. Third, about how fragile monuments and narratives are. The Gettysburg battlefield today is covered with hundreds of monuments and obelisks. Each one was erected to commemorate someone or a unit, but the sum of these monuments does not fully reflect the reality of the war. Which stories are told, whose voices are heard, whose names are engraved. These are choices, and choices carry values. Finally, it must be said that what truly makes Gettysburg meaningful is not the numbers. 51,000 casualties is a massive figure, but numbers numb and abstract the mind. What makes Gettysburg meaningful is the sum of every individual moment experienced in those 3 days. Reynolds falling from his horse, Chamberlain's bayonet order, Armistead crossing the stone wall and falling, the face Longstreet turned away, Lee's words, "This is my fault." These moments bring the abstract flow of history down to a human dimension. And without this human dimension, history is merely a pile of numbers and maps. Gettysburg harbors both one of the best and one of the most complex moments in American history. The best, because ordinary people displayed unbelievable composure and courage under extraordinary conditions. The most complex, because this courage was shown both for freedom and for maintaining slavery, at the same time, on the same terrain, with the same bullets. This paradox is American history itself. One town, 1 July, 3 days, and behind it, a wound that has still not fully healed,